I'm running a pair of these, two 15-inch subwoofers, $600 each. And before we get into how this sub sounds, I want to talk about what doesn't get enough attention here. Most people are out here chasing better speakers. When their speakers are probably fine for the most part, the thing holding back their system more might be what's going on underneath 80 Hertz. A good subwoofer doesn't just add bass, it transforms what your speakers are already doing. Or at the very least, it makes them more capable. At that $600 price point, most people are going to be shopping a 10 or a 12-inch sub. That's going to be things like the SBS SB1000, the Rel T0, some JBLs, some Polks, none of which really match up spec-wise. The Stark SW15 is a 15-inch sub at $599. It may not have some of the fancy apps that you get on something like the SVS, but in a lot of cases, you're not even gonna need that. So today we're on the Stark Sound Brio SW15, and if you're just shopping by price, it looks like another budget sub. But look closer and it's not easy to find something that actually compares to this one for one. You get a 15-inch driver, 475 watts RMS, reaches down to 14 Hertz. The specs matter, but the real story is what those specs cost you, and what happens to your whole system when you hand the bottom end off to something that can actually handle it. Also, we're going to talk about running a pair of these, and I need you to understand that this conversation is not about adding more volume with more subs. That's a common misconception, and we're going to cover that as well. So the sub itself, the SW15, is a no-nonsense, matte black, one finish option, no frills, 55-pound sub. It has a decent amount of weight to it, especially at this price point, which at this price generally means the cabinet isn't doing anything damaging acoustically. You're not going to hear it buzzing or rattling against itself. It's a sealed enclosure, it does its job, and it gets out of the way. And I do call this one no frills, but that actually does undersell this a little bit. It's well put together, it does have a nice finish, there's some small details that make it feel a step above its price point. You're not embarrassed to have this one in your room by any means. Real quick, I want to show you guys something. This is my third FlexiSpot desk. There's one in my office, there's actually one in my wife's office, and this E7 Pro is gonna go in my kids' room. Two of them are big enough now that they've been asking for a space to work, if they wanna draw, do some homework, all of that kind of stuff. And I might even surprise them with a simple speaker system for the room that can sit on top of the desk here. I think that'd be kind of fun. The E7 Pro is the one that I would recommend if you're buying for the first time or you're looking to replace something that's gotten wobbly or just worn out. With this one, wobbly won't ever enter the conversation. It's really solid. 440 pounds of static load capacity, dual motors, 3-stage legs with this semi-C-frame design that stays lock solid even when you crank it all the way up to 50.6 inches. The C-frame also means the legs aren't right under your feet the whole time. The last thing you want is to be playing bumper cars when you're sitting in your chair and you're just bumping against it. As for the height adjustment, 25 inches at the low end means that my kids can actually use this as a desk, not sort of use it and just be kind of reaching the whole time. And on the other side of it, on the max height, I mean, you're able to do anything you want. Standing duties, you're obviously not going to have any trouble for kids there, but this is easily tall enough for any kind of adult, unless you happen to play in the NBA, I guess. These are honestly pretty versatile. It's one desk, all the different heights, simple adjustments for different people. There's really no arguments here. All of that's really useful in a house when you do have 4 kids though. Although kid number 4 is about 6 months old, so I think his only demonstration might be a diaper changing table, and I would guess that nobody wants to see that one. Also, the anti-collision is really important here, as my kids are gonna have their hands all over this one. Or if maybe you have pets, pets, small humans running around, this is gonna offer up another layer of protection. The desk hits something on the way down, it just stops and backs off. Also, there's a kid lock too, so nobody's randomly raising it to the ceiling for fun. I'm sure they're going to try it. You're also going to get a 15-year warranty on this one, 30-day risk-free return. A standing desk is a piece of furniture that you're going to be using every single day. Like I said, I actually have 3 of these, and all of them are still working great, and I would have no problems recommending these to other people. FlexiSpot is running a big sale right now too, so you guys should check out the deals. There's free shipping, as well as some other special discounts available. Use my discount below for some extra savings. And if the E7 Pro is out of your price range, the E7 is just one step down, and it's still a legit option. I just point you towards the Pro if the budget is there. Links are in the description. Now back to the video. On the back, you've got RCA stereo inputs, a dedicated sub input, and XLR if your pre or processor support's balanced. You also get a switch for auto on-off, crossover, phase, all physical knobs, no apps here. There's also not going to be any built-in room correction. You're going to be dialing this in by ear, or you're going to run RU, or you're going to let your AVR do the work. And I think that's perfectly fine. Most people in this hobby also already have something in the chain that can handle the sub control, whether that's Odyssey, a mini DSP, or something even like the Weem Ultra for 2-channel. That can do a lot with subs as well. Taking a look at the driver, it's a one-piece glass fiber cone, high excursion, and the amp connected to it puts out 475 watts RMS and 950 watts peak. It's going to be enough to keep that cone moving, and it also keeps it controlled when you push this one pretty loud. Taking a look at the value comparison here, $600 in the subwoofer market gets you typically a 10 or a 12-inch driver. And that's just where the market sits today. The SVS SB2000 Pro, that's a well-regarded 12-inch sub at around $899. Then there's Rel's T9X, that's a 10-inch sub and it's pushing close to $2,000 these days. Both of these are solid, well-reviewed products, but both are also smaller drivers that do cost more money. And that's kind of the theme that I'm getting at here. On the other side of that, the SW15 is a 15-inch sub, and that size just doesn't exist at this price from really anyone else out there. You're going to get more cone area, more air movement, deeper extension than what the competition is going to offer at this price point. The closest competition that I can think of off the top of my head is probably like the RSL Speedwoofer 12S. That's a great sub, but it's nearly $300 more and takes up close to twice the space. So it's a different product, different price point. I've also heard a lot of subs that cost 3, 4, 5 times as much as this one costs. The gap is real out there when you start spending more money. It's just not 3 to 5 times the price real. The diminishing returns curve works very heavily in the SW15's favor here. So how do they pull this price point off? Like I said, no frills, no crazy DSP, no wireless, no color options beyond matte black. Those things cost money to develop. If you want room correction, you're gonna have to bring your own here, and I think that's perfectly fine at this price point. Also, most people in this hobby already have something that can handle it. Then there's the direct-to-consumer pricing that keeps the dealer margins out of the equation. That really does add a lot to the price when you have to, sell these at a store. These go direct to the consumer, and it helps you save a little bit that way. At the end of the day, they built a sub that performs, and they didn't pad the bill with features that add allure on the spec sheet without really adding a whole lot else. Now, obviously, we have to come back to this being a $600 sub. It's going to give up something, right? It's not going to be all world beating. That just doesn't make sense. It's really not fair to say that. I think of the SW15 primarily as a home theater sub that can pull off 2-channel duty when called upon. It pressurizes a room exceptionally well. It hits hard. It does go genuinely low. And for music, it's honestly way better than the price suggests. It just isn't exceptional in a way a more expensive music-focused sub is exceptional. And I want to be clear about that because the term giant killer, that just gets thrown around way too often and it's generally just used for clicks from YouTubers. And honestly, a true giant killer is pretty rare. The SW15 is an incredible value, and that's different, and it's still a very good thing. I'm being a little picky with this, but I do need to pass judgment and just give you an idea what you're gonna get here when you're buying like a budget sub versus a really high-end sub, or maybe something more like a music focus versus home theater focus. Where you might feel the differences in music, where the bass needs to feel natural and kind of like placed in the room within a mix. A pricier music-focused sub may give you kind of like a tighter, more articulate low end. The SW15 doesn't disappear quite the same way as some of these more expensive models can, but at the same time, if you're new to subwoofers and shopping at this price point, you're gonna be nothing but impressed here. It does a fantastic job for anything in this price range. And for movies, for rock, for anything that actually needs to move you or the things on your wall, this sub does not apologize. And I want to make a point here that I think gets missed a lot. If you're running bookshelf speakers or modest towers, and you're frustrated that your system doesn't sound as full as you want it to, your speakers are probably not the problem here. Most speakers doing real work below 80 Hertz are working harder than they need to, which means they're going to be compressing, there's going to be some distortion. They're doing all the things, that's hurting everything else above it. The imaging's going to suffer, the mid-range is going to be a little bit muddy, the whole presentation feels smaller than it really should. Hand that low frequency off to a dedicated sub and something is going to click. Your speakers stop struggling, the mid-range clears up, the soundstage opens. A pair of $500 bookshelves, just for an example on that price point, they're going to sound so much better when you pair them with the sub. It's going to sound like a much bigger speaker, things that can cost, multitudes more. And that's really not an embellishment. It's just physics when you start bringing in some of these big drivers to pair with the smaller bookshelves. The SW15 at $599 is one of the most cost-effective ways to make that happen. It goes low enough, it has enough output, and it blends well enough that your speakers get to do what they're actually good at. And on the topic of running two of these, I think running two of them just changes things in ways that aren't obvious until you hear it. Most people assume a second subwoofer just means more bass, louder, more obnoxious, whatever, right? That's really not what's happening, and the real benefit is way more practical than that. Every room has room modes. Certain bass frequencies pile up in some spots and cancel out in others. You sit in the wrong chair and the whole octave disappears. And it's not because the sub is bad, it's just how sound waves work in your space. One subwoofer, regardless of the quality, can only drive the room from one point. You're going to get hot spots and you're going to get dead zones. Two subwoofers from two different positions are going to drive the room from multiple angles. Bass response evens out across the whole space, and the person sitting off to the side is going to get that same low end as the person sitting in the sweet spot. That's going to be really noticeable in movies, for example, when you're often watching with other people, which I'd say is pretty common, right? There's the headroom argument as well. Each sub is going to be doing less work to hit the same output level, which also means less distortion, less stress on the drivers, more dynamic range when it's called upon. And remember what we talked about with the small speakers? Two subs doing this means your speakers are going to be even more liberated. The whole system's going to sound bigger, more effortless, more open. Your speakers stop working and they just play the music. So the math here, two SW15s is $1,200. Two 15-inch subwoofers, 475 watts each, down to 14 hertz. Find me another way to get dual 15-inch subs with that kind of extension and output for that money. I've personally built some of the DIY 15-inch subs, and by the time you're done buying the drivers, building the enclosures, finishing the enclosures, and getting an amp, you're really not saving anything. In a lot of cases, you're going to be spending more depending on what you pick. And just kind of closing up the dual sub topic, running this pair with the tracks that I regularly use to stress test low end, you're going to find the room just pressurizes differently than a single sub does. It is very noticeable. If you have room for two, seriously consider going that route. I know not everyone has room for two subs, but if you can, it does make a difference. On to some brief sound impressions on this. I think this sub is going to surprise a lot of you right out of the box. You expect a 15-inch sub at this price point to sound kind of big, obvious, and sloppy. It really doesn't. It takes some dialing in. Subwoofer placement always does. You're going to be doing the sub crawl, the measurements, the whole thing. But once it's there, it disappears into a system in a good way, the way that a sub should. And at moderate levels, it's really clean and controlled. That part really surprised me. And even when I was pushing it hard, I would say that this stayed very composed. Your walls are going to shake before this one runs out of ideas on how to create you some more bass. And that 14 hertz extension is going to be key for movies. Content that actually goes that low, you're going to feel that in your chest. The tactile thing that you can't hear, but you can obviously feel. That's what 15 inches of cone and real power does. It's also what frees up your speakers to do the rest. In closing, the audiophile world has a habit of dismissing budget gear. The SW15 doesn't belong in that category, and calling it budget gear is honestly a little misleading at this point. Is this the last word in subwoofer performance? No, obviously it's not. It's $600. If you spend $3,000, you're going to get something more precise, more musical. If two-channel listening is your whole world, that gap is going to exist and it's worth knowing. But it's also not an absolute here. For the money, and especially as a pair, there really isn't much that competes here. $1,200 for two 15-inch subs that perform like this is a deal that just doesn't make sense when you look at what else is out there. And if you're sitting there with a pair of bookshelves or modest towers that aren't doing what you want them to do, this is worth a very serious look. One or two of these dialed in properly, and your system sounds like a completely different setup. Not because the bass is louder, because everything else gets room to breathe. The links are going to be in the description. Please consider subscribing. Let's grow this community together. Take care. Talk soon. Later.